Welcome back to the War Room, where we're going to take a look at one of the key Union victories in the American Civil War, the capture of New Orleans in 1862. This was primarily a brown water naval enterprise, which is to say it concerns mucking about on rivers, so there are some interesting tactical elements to consider, along with the fact that this is a time of transition in naval technology. At the same time, there were operational challenges for both attackers and defenders, as well as significant strategic drivers, so we've got plenty to get stuck into here. One of the key features of the American Civil War was the disparity in resources between North and South. The North not only had a much larger population, 22.5 million compared to the South's 9.5, but it was massively more industrialized. In 1860, a year before the war started, 90% of American manufacturers were in the North. To put this in some kind of perspective, the North started the war with the same number of manufacturing establishments as the South had factory workers, 110,000. The North also had 71% of the railway track and produced 97% of the arms. Naval expansion is always a good indicator of realized industrial potential, given that ships always require a vast array of components from different sectors. The Union Navy didn't just expand from 42 commissioned ships to 671 over the course of the war. It emerged from the war at the cutting edge of naval technology, transitioning from sail propulsion and wooden armour to a fleet where a third of the vessels were steam-powered and 70 of them were ironclad. By contrast, the Confederate economy was fundamentally an agricultural export economy. Southern states accounted for 70% of pre-war US exports, 75% of that trade was in cotton. The South essentially had a monopoly on global cotton supplies on which the immense textile industries of Britain and France depended. So while the Confederacy couldn't compete with the North in terms of sheer industrial production, it could potentially offset that by overseas trade, exporting cotton to fund the import of arms and other war materiel. In the course of the war, the South even sidestepped its own limited shipbuilding capacity by placing orders with British shipyards. The obvious problem with this is that the Confederate States inherited an even less impressive navy than the Union. It had a grand total of 14 seaworthy vessels at the start of the war, and its limited industrial base hamstrung its ability to expand. Union naval superiority allowed them to impose a blockade on the South and start to strangle its vital economic links with Europe. This was a component of General-in-Chief Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan, which sought to choke out the Southern economy. There was some hope in the Confederacy that the Union blockade would backfire diplomatically. The South was already reaching out to Britain and France for recognition, support, and, in its wildest dreams, intervention. With the blockade impacting the supply of cotton, the textile-dependent economies of the European powers would suffer and provoke them into getting involved in the Civil War. Even accepting the diplomatic risk, and considering the lack of naval resistance on behalf of the Confederacy, enforcing a blockade of the South was a difficult prospect. The Confederate States had a combined coastline of 3,500 miles. As such, Union naval attention initially focused on major southern ports. First amongst these was the city of New Orleans. New Orleans was the biggest city in the Confederacy, with a population of 160,000, bigger in fact than the next 4 cities combined. It was the last port on the Mississippi River, and as such the funnel through which all the resources of the vast Mississippi Basin reached the sea. That made New Orleans a key choke point on the Confederate economy, but it posed 2 big problems for the blockade. First of all, there's 100 miles of Mississippi Delta between New Orleans and the Gulf of Mexico. The Delta is a huge area of silt, coastal wetlands, and small waterways that extends out into the Gulf. Larger, deeper draft vessels, like Union warships, were restricted to a few relatively narrow channels, but these smaller, shallower draft vessels used by blockade runners had a lot more options and could get past the blockade relatively easily. The obvious counter to this was to simply sail up to New Orleans, seize the city, and thus control the choke point. But the deep channel up the Delta was protected by 2 forts, Fort Jackson with 74 guns and Fort San Felipe on the opposite bank with 52. Between them, These fortifications covered a bend in the river where approaching ships would be forced to slow down. The strong current and a boom placed across the river completed the setup, meaning that Union ships trying to reach New Orleans would have to move past the forts at a crawl, exposing them to concentrated fire. The combined strength of its coastal fortifications and geographic position meant that the Confederacy did not judge New Orleans to be at significant risk from the sea. To landward, the city was accessible via the Mississippi, but it was also as deep in the southern states as it was possible to go. The river itself was a vital transportation link for Confederate movement, both military and economic. The southern states just didn't have the same level of railway infrastructure as the north, so they relied more heavily on riverine communications. Unfortunately for the South, the Mississippi's north-south axis meant that it cut the Confederacy in half. The second component of Scott's Anaconda Plan was for Union forces to fight their way downriver from the north, simultaneously denying its use and breaking the South in two. In early 1862, Federal forces had reached Memphis, but this was still 640 miles upriver from New Orleans, and there were several important Confederate fortifications barring the way south, not least those at Vicksburg. As a result, the city was considered relatively safe, and the garrison was stripped of troops and vessels to be sent north. By the time it became clear that the Union was focusing its attention on the city, it was defended by the 111 men manning Forts Jackson and St. Philippe, about 3,000 poorly armed short-term militiamen, and a handful of gunboats under the command of Major General Mansfield Lovell. Lovell did have 3 tricks up his sleeve, though. New Orleans was one of the South's few centres of industry, and in late 1861 the Confederacy began construction on 2 ironclads in the city's shipyards, the CSS Louisiana and the CSS Mississippi. Unlike the gunboats defending the city, which were just armed civilian vessels, these were intended to be modern armoured warships capable of going toe-to-toe with the Union Navy. In fact, in March 1862, another Confederate ironclad, the CSS Virginia, formerly the USS Merrimack, attacked the Union squadron blockading Norfolk Naval Base and would have sunk or driven it off completely were it not countered by the presence of the first northern ironclad, USS Monitor. 2 similar vessels on the Mississippi would give the Federals serious pause for thought if they considered attacking New Orleans. Assuming, of course, that the ironclads were completed. Construction was slow going given the South's limited industrial base, steam engines of sufficient size presented a particular challenge, and the race against time to get the vessels completed was complicated to Lovell's mounting despair by labour disputes in the shipyards, including a 3-week strike. New Orleans could count on the CSS Manassas, though. This was already up and running, a steam tug that had been armoured over, fitted with a forward-facing 13-inch gun and a ram, and Manassas already had some battle experience. Back in October 1861, the Union blockading squadron had taken up a position in the delta called the Head of Passes. This was essentially the centre of a star of channels towards the end of the delta, which the Confederates had believed to be behind some sandbars inaccessible to deep-draft Union vessels. That rapidly turned out to be untrue, and a small squadron stationed there effectively choked off the major routes leading in and out of New Orleans. To counter the Union advance, the Confederates conducted a night attack led by CSS Manassas, with a few gunboats and some fire rafts in support. At 0340 on October the 11th, Manassas snuck up on the USS Richmond, a 2,700-ton screw sloop, and attempted to ram it. Unluckily for Manassas, Richmond had a barge alongside that night and she hit that instead. Rather more luckily, panic broke out among the Union vessels, which began firing off into the dark on all sides. This only worsened as Manassas fired a rocket signal and the Confederate gunboats upstream lit and let loose their fire rafts. The rafts didn't achieve anything, floating down on the current, but the Union flag officer Captain John Pope, not the famous one, ordered a withdrawal. The Richmond and the Vincennes, another sloop, beached on a bar as they tried to get away, coming under fire from the gunboats, which outranged them. This fire was not very effective. The gunboats only had a small single 6-pounder gun each and they barely scored any hit, but it served to deepen the Union panic. The USS Vincennes was actually abandoned at one point, with its captain ordering its magazine blown so the Confederates couldn't capture it, A further ignominy spared the US Navy by an engineer who lit the fuse to the magazine and then quietly cut the burning end off and tossed it overboard. In the aftermath of the battle, there were no casualties on either side. In fact, the CSS Manassas has probably suffered the most damage as the result of its ram, but the tiny engagement was a clear psychological victory for the Confederacy. Beyond immediate embarrassment, though, the battle kicked New Orleans up the US Navy's hit list. In late 1861, Commander David Dixon Porter arrived in Washington with a plan to take the city. Porter was an experienced naval officer. His father had commanded the frigate USS Essex during the War of 1812. Porter himself joined the Navy at 16, saw service and received his first command in the Mexican War. Critically for the upcoming operation against New Orleans, he had left the Navy in 1848 and spent some time captaining merchant ships going in and out of the city. Combined with his experience in the Gulf blockading squadron after rejoining the Navy at the start of the Civil War, Porter had a detailed understanding of the route upriver and the defences the Union would be facing. Of these, he believed Forts Jackson and San Felipe posed the greatest problem. Once past them, though, a fleet with enough firepower could simply sail up to New Orleans and force it to surrender under threat of bombardment. To deal with the forts, Porter intended to use their position against them. The same bend in the river that would slow approaching ships down for the Confederate guns offered a position for a flotilla of mortar vessels to tie up and engage the forts indirectly. Ideally, deluging the forts with mortar bombs would neutralize them. If not, the bombardment would provide cover for the rest of the fleet to rush past. Leaving an army garrison to hold New Orleans, the US Navy could then range further up the Mississippi and ultimately link up with the combined Army-Navy force fighting its way south. Porter's plan was accepted and he was placed in command of the planned mortar flotilla, but the Navy needed another officer to take command of the fleet itself. Many of the US Navy's officers were needed where they were, others were considered to lack the nerve or experience necessary for the task. Eventually, Porter and the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, G.V. Fox, settled on their 37th choice, James Glasgow Farragut. Farragut was not only tremendously experienced, but he and Porter knew each other very well. Farragut had been adopted as a boy by Porter's father, serving as a young midshipman in the War of 1812. By 1861, he was 60 years old and had over 50 years of active naval service. With the coming of the Civil War, though, the Navy had considered his personal links to the South, by birth and twice by marriage, potential for Confederate sympathies, and they had shunted him sideways into the Naval Retirement Board where he couldn't make much trouble. In the event, Farragut was vehemently anti-secession, and he jumped at the chance to lead the attack. By April 1862 then, Farragut's fleet had gotten into position downstream of the forts. Porter had a total of 21 mortar schooners, each mounting a single 13-inch weapon, and with the flotilla holding position around the bend, just below where the Confederates had cleared the bankside foliage to extend their fields of fire, they opened fire on April the 18th. The bombardment was nowhere near as effective as Porter had hoped. Most of the damage appeared cosmetic, and the fighting capability of the forts was barely reduced. Farragut, having never placed much faith in the mortar bombardment, was already preparing to make the run. On the night of the 20th, he sent gunboats forward to cut the boom across the river, but prevailing winds from the north that would have slowed his ships down in the run delayed his actual attack until the morning of the 24th. The Confederates hadn't been idle while all this was going on. Lovell had sent his own flotilla down to the forts, led by Manassas. The CSS Mississippi was on the verge of being launched, but was still awaiting delivery of its drive shaft. Louisiana was in float and indeed commissioned, but it had such teething problem with its underpowered engines that it couldn't move under its own power. Lovell had it towed down and tied to the bank near Fort San Felipe to act as a floating battery. Farragut started his attack at 0200, splitting his 17 ships into 3 divisions. Confederate lookouts raised the alarm as the 1st Division reached the gap in the Boone at about 0340, but 8 ships had gotten through before they opened fire. When they did, all hell broke loose. The Confederates had lit fires along the riverbank to illuminate the passing ships, letting fire rafts loose into the current and engaging them from the forts, while Porter's mortars were throwing shells overhead and the Union warships started pumping broadsides into the fortifications. Farragut's orders were for everyone to keep going at all costs. The wooden fleet had more guns in total, but there was no way it would survive a slugging match against the pre-ranged masonry forts. The combination of night and chaos made accuracy a challenge for everyone though. The Manassas moved in to attempt to ram, but found itself engaged from the shore and withdrew to try again upstream where only the Union would be shooting at it. The Confederate tug Mosher pushed a fire raft into the USS Hartford, Farragut's flagship, before being sunk by a broadside for its trouble, though it briefly forced the Hartford aground. Most of the Union fleet made it through without suffering significant damage, though the last 3 gunboats turned back in the face of all the fire. Beyond the forts, Farragut's ships engaged the Confederate flotilla. Manassas managed to ram the USS Mississippi and the USS Brooklyn, failing to sink either before being rammed herself by Mississippi and being forced ashore where she was pummeled with broadsides. The crew abandoned ship, Manassas caught fire and then drifted downriver where it later exploded and sank. The lead Federal vessel USS Varuna got into a fight with the Governor Moore, a Confederate gunboat, which ended with Moore ramming Varuna twice and sinking her, though she took so much damage in the process, including shooting through her own deck to get the angle to engage Varuna, that her helmsman ran her aground and her crew abandoned ship. By dawn it was all over. Farragut had powered through the gauntlet, the Confederate flotilla was out of action, and he was on his way to New Orleans. When his remaining 14 vessels arrived on April the 25th, he found an open city. Lovell had retreated, a mob gathered in the rain on the bank opposite the Federal fleet, but didn't stop a couple of officers coming ashore and raising the stars and stripes. The only distant hope left of the defenders, the unfinished CSS Mississippi, came floating downstream from the yards, on fire from stem to stern to deny her to the Union. Back down at the forts, Porter had kept up his bombardment until April the 29th, when the enlisted men of Fort Jackson mutinied and surrendered. While the mortars hadn't done significant damage to the batteries or casemates of the fort, it had breached the levees nearby in several places. The interior was starting to flood and conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Without the support of the larger Fort Jackson, Fort San Felipe surrendered as well. CSS Louisiana, still stuck at the riverside, was blown up by her crew. In short order, General Benjamin Butler followed the Navy upriver with 18,000 troops to take possession of New Orleans. Farragut went on to take Baton Rouge and Natchez before being turned back by the guns at Vicksburg. Despite that reversal, the South simply didn't have the resources to retake New Orleans, nor resecure its great artery, the Mississippi River. The city would remain in Union hands until the end of the war, a severe blow to the Confederacy that effectively teed up a second, arguably worse disaster, the loss of the Mississippi itself. Tactically speaking, it's hard to imagine Farragut's run of the forts succeeding without steam propulsion. The Mississippi is a huge river with a powerful current. Obviously, sailing ships had been travelling up the delta to New Orleans for over 150 years by the time of the Civil War, but not at the kinds of speeds that would allow them to blow through the barrage put up by Forts Jackson and San Felipe without being crippled. In a similar vein, both the Union and Confederate ships engaging each other on the river were so much more manoeuvrable because they were relying on screws or paddles instead of the wind. Forts had traditionally been significant deterrents to naval action. Nelson famously said a ship's a fool to fight a fort. But this was as much a component of the relatively limited ability of sailing vessels to manoeuvre as it was the comparative vulnerability of wooden ships and stone forts. Thanks to the Battle of Forts Jackson and San Felipe, along with other incidents in which Union naval forces successfully neutralized Confederate coastal fortifications, the Federals became more comfortable considering ship-on-fort engagements. These didn't all go the Union's way, even later in the war, with heavily armoured ironclads mounting much larger guns than Farragut. In fact, the use of firepower alone to overwhelm enemy positions and force them to surrender, as Porter intended with his mortars, was, and still is, up in the air. Overall, this was a transitional period in naval technology where the path forward was mixed up with dead ends, diversions, and contradictions. But the relationship between forts and ships was starting to change as the technological developments of the mid-19th century bore fruit. Ultimately, this fuzzy tactical space in the 1860s allowed the US Navy to widen its strategic impact on the Confederacy. being able or willing to go toe-to-toe with southern coastal fortifications meant that the Federals didn't have to restrict themselves to just blockading the south. From the start of the war, they had taken measures to secure harbours and ports along the Confederate coastline, both to deny those locations to blockade runners and to serve as bases for Union ships, as well as to pressure the Confederacy into diverting forces to secure its massive coastline. These expeditions inevitably saw the North having to engage coastal batteries and forts. While Farragut and Porter were preparing to breach the Mississippi, other combined Navy-Army forces were operating against Confederate coastal fortifications in North Carolina. These may have been less substantial than Forts Jackson and St. Philippe, but they represented a toe in the door of strategic effect before Farragut kicked it open. Seizing New Orleans was a major blow to the Confederacy. The loss of the city itself was serious enough, but it set the stage for increased pressure in the Mississippi theatre, and that culminated in 1863 with the fall of Vicksburg. With the Mississippi River firmly under federal control, Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and the Arizona Territory were carved off from the rest of the South, and the Union could concentrate on the eastern half of the Confederacy. War is always a contest of will as much as a contest in materiel, but with New Orleans gone and the Mississippi to follow, everything got harder for the southern states. Blockade runners had lost a major port, the South's already inferior industrial, agricultural, and human resources had been reduced even further. Confederate hopes of exploiting cotton exports as a diplomatic lever to encourage European intervention faded as well. Slim as the chances might have always been, the threshold for Britain and France to get involved had now ratcheted up. A purely naval exercise in breaking the Union blockade and escorting cotton-laden Confederate vessels from New Orleans across the Atlantic was one thing. The kind of commitment involved in retaking the city from Union forces and going on to secure the cotton-producing hinterland was entirely another, especially given that the capture of New Orleans represented just one more sign that the Confederacy was not the horse to back in the Civil War. That said, the South hung on for another 4 years after New Orleans. The reality of sea and later air and space power is that they cannot be decisive in and of themselves. They can only create the conditions for decisive action in the land domain. Even amphibious operations, with one boot wet as it were, can only set the stage and introduce the characters. The real nails wouldn't go into the Confederate coffin until Grant's overland campaign and Sherman's march to the sea from 1864 on, but actions like the capture of New Orleans did a lot to line those nails up. So, that's a quick look at the capture of New Orleans in the American Civil War, a really interesting brown water operation with strategic consequences in a time of naval technological transition. Hope you all enjoyed this episode of The War Room. If you'd like to see these videos early and support the channel, you can do so via Patreon and YouTube memberships, whether you do or not. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.